shut me up. They'll have to kill me first.
I spent 10 years or so meeting people who are active in populist movements. When we published a book on national populism in 2018, one of the people that I was always interested in was Steve Bannon, because of his very visible influence over President Trump.
Hey, gents, how we doing? Any words? Merry Christmas!
But also because of his very visible interest in intellectual currents that are sweeping through Western politics, and that basically led to us having a coffee and a conversation in London, I think in late 2018, early 2019. And my impression of Steve Bannon, I think firstly was that he has a pretty solid grasp of what's going on in Western democracies. Secondly, however, he has a worldview of what's happening in the West, which doesn't always transplant from America to Europe as well as he may think. So if you go back to the Trump presidency, there was a view at the time that what Donald Trump had started was going to spread across much of Europe. In reality, the opposite was true. Populists were already on their way in Europe, and then Trump was elected in 2016. But nonetheless, Bannon's view, suddenly expressed to me, was that these movements are only going to get stronger and stronger, and that because of the failings, as he saw it, of the established political class, more and more people were going to turn to them. But if you actually look at what's happened in Europe since the Trump presidency, Marine Le Pen has reached the highest level of support that she's ever won in. Viktor Orban, record high support. Giorgia Meloni and the Brothers of Italy, which actually originates in an openly fascist movement. Sweden Democrats become the second most popular party in Spain. Sweden broken through. Chega in regional level have broken. And even populists who have lost office. Bolsonaro in Brazil, the Alternative for Germany. Yes, they've lost, but actually their support has remained fairly stable. And this is one of the arguments I think Bannon makes, which is that if you look at the cycle of politics and you take a step back from the day-to-day and you actually look at the evolution of political systems, he has basically put all of his chips on the bet that these movements are just going to become stronger and stronger and stronger. And so far, certainly in Europe, that seems to be the case. That is what's happening over the longer term.
I'm a friend and colleague. I will make observations and give my opinions where they saw it. No, absolutely not. I've never taken a penny in any political activity. Trump never paid. I've never taken a penny. The first time I ever went to a campaign office is the day I took over as Trump's CEO. I'm not a professional political. I'm not a professional political consultant.
For someone like Bannon, he sees an establishment, he sees an administrative state, he sees these old Republicans, the Ryan Republicans, the old establishment Republicans, and these are like entrenched interests, which, how do you fight that? How do you bring change to America in the face of these entrenched interests? Well, you blow them up. And once you've blown them up, then you can introduce your version. But the blowing up was very important, because without the blowing up, there is no Bannon-style change.
It's always worth remembering in politics that movements that have an enormous impact tend to be led by a very small number of people, but those people tend to be highly committed, very radical, completely sure of themselves. They have a very strong belief in themselves, a very powerful sense of agency, that they are at the frontier of history and that they're shaping and cultivating these currents that are sweeping through politics. And I think Steve Bannon is one of those people. I think he clearly sees himself as part of the vanguard who is able to shape and influence mass opinion on some of these issues. And looking back over the last 6-7 years since the Trump presidency, he and Trump clearly did that.
Bannon's only a Republican because you've got to be one or the other in order to take power in America. You know, Trump and Bannon, they're not real Republicans. They're actually, in some ways, they're sort of anarcho-populists who just happen to be under the flag of republicanism.
The ideology of national populism, which I think is a very distinctive ideology, it promotes the interest in the culture of the nation state against what it argues are corrupt, self-serving and distant elites that can be traced back really as far as the 1890s. I mean, the first serious populist movement in the West was probably the US People's Party that campaigned around that time. But then as you go through history, you think about the Pujadist movement in France in the 1950s, you think about Jörg Haider and the Freedom Party in Austria in the 1980s and 1990s. You know, these were influential movements. As long as we've had mass representative democracy, we've had national populism. So through all of that history, we've had thinkers and intellectuals who have been contributing to these particular ideas. So ideas around nationalism, the need to prioritize the nation and the national group above minorities and other nations. A particular critique of liberal democracy, which populists argue has become elitist, has become narrow and insular, and is no longer in touch with the masses and the people. In many respects, when you look at people like Steve Bannon, Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage, they are closer to the classical vision of democracy, the Athenian vision of democracy, which was about direct democracy. It was about prioritizing the popular will above the elite, above minorities, which of course in today's politics can become highly problematic when you've got lots of different competing demands and interests in very diverse societies.
People's political ideology can come from any variety of sources. In many instances, it comes from our parents. Many people vote the same way as their parents. Or some people witness events that makes them look at the world in a new way. One of the key events for Steve Bannon and what really influences his political ideology is looking at the hostage crisis in the late 1970s under the Jimmy Carter presidency and seeing the Iranians kidnapping all these Americans and holding them hostage for weeks and weeks and months. And for Bannon, who was at this point serving in the US Navy, you know, the supposedly mighty power was being given a humiliation and a kind of bloody nose by a relatively small country. And for Bannon, this felt kind of disgraceful. And so this is one of those germs that's going to give rise to Bannon's ideology.
His beliefs have really emerged over a very long period of time through his experience in the military, through his experience of living and being stationed abroad, through his experience of reading widely, including lots of interest in ideas and philosophies in the Far East and a lot within sort of what you might call American reactionary politics. And I think in some respects when I look at Steve Bannon, I sort of see a synthesis of lots of different ideas that have come from lots of different thinkers and literatures, and he sort of molded them into this quite reactionary, if not revolutionary, view of where democracy, and in particular where the American Republic, is headed.
When Bannon was in the Navy, he kept something very, very quiet. And what he kept quiet was his interest in kind of esoteric religions. He was, very much into a movement called traditionalism with a capital T. This isn't just, you want things to be as they were. Traditionalism is a kind of very obscure movement rooted in almost kind of neo-fascist ideas. This is something that Bannon's very much drawn to, a lot, along with lots of obscure thinkers. And so he is getting immersed in some seriously off-the-wall crazy thinking at the same time as actually having quite a conservative life in the Navy and then, a conservative life in banking. So he's got these two sides to him. He's got the money-making side, the kind of heavy drinking, getting divorced side, and then he's got this side that's into kind of mysticism, really esoteric, weird stuff. Why? Because it shows that he is not thinking in regular political terms about, how's that policy going to go down with the people. He is looking at politics as a way of destroying a system. He's not a conservative in the sense he wants to keep the institutions. He thinks America's institutions are broken. So, he is a destructive force. And all that esotericism and mysticism, it makes him see everything in kind of mystical terms rather than relatively simple political terms.
He's also clearly influenced by this idea that human civilization and political development tends to go in cycles. And I think he genuinely believes that we're approaching the end of a particular cycle that will bring about some kind of large-scale clash or conflict. And this is a critical point when it comes to populists and people like Steve Bannon. Declineism, the belief that Western civilization is not just stagnating, but is decaying and declining, and that have projected this very clear belief that strong men are needed in order to rally the masses and bring forward this new man who can save the nation from this imminent collapse. That idea is incredibly potent and powerful and has played a very significant role, I think, in the evolution of politics on the right for 100 years or more.
One of the hallmarks of populism and this whole idea of national populism is this imagined past that's perfect. And that is what populism wants to go back to. A lot of people think, things were better back then at its most simplest. And they have this idea that at some point in history, their country was perfect. It's an imaginary state. As a historian, I know that the world has never been perfect. No one country has ever been in a state of perfect bliss. Yet to the populist movement, there was a time. But ask them, okay, which year was everything perfect? And I will tell you during that year, bad things happened to your country. So in many ways, it's complete junk. You've got to remember that Steve Bannon, despite his somewhat dishevelled, grizzled appearance, is actually got a razor-sharp brain. Okay, he's not stupid. This is a man with lots of degrees, including an MBA from Harvard Business School. Stupid people do not get MBAs from Harvard Business School.
The Graduate School of Business Administration has, for 40 years, been training men professionally for responsibilities in business leadership.
This is a man who ends up working for the financial powerhouse that is Goldman Sachs in mergers and acquisitions. and starts to make a hell of a lot of money. And he's really smart. He's a real workaholic. And what's more, he leaves Goldman Sachs actually to form his own merchant bank. Okay, that requires an enormous amount of drive, energy, foresight, and he makes a lot of money investing in media. And he is looking ahead at which direction, media is going and making a lot of money. He even invests in the hit series Seinfeld. So, every time there's a kind of rerun of a Seinfeld, Steve Bannon gets a little bit of money and gets that little bit richer.
All right, fine. You want to see it? I want to see it. Okay. Yeah, check that out. Whoa. This is unbelievable. I told you.
Bannon has an enormous amount of contacts in the financial world, in the entertainment world, because he was a heavy investor in Hollywood movies, in TV. He made films, political films.
Citizens of the world, we are anonymous.
I say take the FBI, the CIA, Homeland Security, go back to hell where your fucking guns came from.
Cameras caught evidence of drug use and paraphernalia.
Like you have hippies in the vault that actually take acid every day.
Hey, asshole!
This woman who didn't.
Bannon's films are designed to shock in some ways. He's wanting to wake people up, in his view. He has got these sort of kind of lurid graphic scenes. There's explosions. It's a violent kind of mishmash.
And I got some bad news for you. This wasn't an accident.
The entire global financial system would melt down.
We would stimulate the economy. You know why? Because we'd go out and pay off bills, pay off tax debts, create jobs, and buy stuff that we need.
What Bannon's against is this whole idea of globalism, this whole idea that, the world's now super connected. What Bannon wants to do is to return to a time in which the nation state is primary. That's why he's a nationalist. He thinks that the nation is the perfect expression of human society, and that's what we should stick to, and we shouldn't get more global. So he hates federalism, he hates the EU, he hates the federal United States. He prefers the states themselves to be just that, separate states.
I can think of two words right now that scare liberals. President Palin.
Do you love your freedom?
I mean, despite her extraordinary in eloquence, she became a darling of that new blossoming alt-right movement.
Bannon looks at a woman like Sarah Palin and he thinks, great, she is a fellow disruptor, but she's also tapping into this idea of the sensible, perfectly reasonable thinking of the kind of middle-class American housewife. And so it's a very alluring figure for Bannon because she looks like a kind of everyday middle-class, middle-aged woman, and yet she's also got these ideas that for Bannon are very, very seductive. He's a man who, in some ways, identified this wave was coming, and he knew how to surf it, and he knew how to control it. And he knew also that it needed to be chaotic. He knew that actually it needed to disrupt things.
She was a champion of our ideals.
I don't give a damn if the phony intelligentsia like it or not. The liberal media don't matter to me. Republican establishment don't matter to me.
To hell with the establishment, because the establishment has put us in this position in the first place.
He was well ahead of the curve in America before Donald Trump. He had a sense that Republican politics were going to be completely changed. I think the Obama presidency, by the way, is key to that.
Now, a year later, I got to ask those supporters of all that, how's that hopey, changey stuff working out for you?
The experience of the Obama presidency radicalized a lot of Republicans, and the legacy also of the global financial crash and the outrage that came through the Occupy protest movements and the backlash against Wall Street, I think really mattered for Steve Bannon. I think actually that was an important moment for him as well. And so in his mind, this sort of corrupt financial system, this kind of radicalizing liberal class, this growing threat from China, all kind of came together and I think gave him this view that actually we were going to see a very strong and sustained backlash against that consensus.
Globalization isn't completely new, but towards the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, it speeded up. The United States began to enter into trade agreements with its neighbors, Canada and Mexico in particular. In 1994, NAFTA was signed. There's obvious examples of these integrations.
The whole thing is ridiculous. NAFTA's been very, very bad for our country. It's been very, very bad for our companies and for our workers. And we're going to make some very big changes, or we are going to get rid of NAFTA for once and for all. Cannot continue like this, believe me.
And there was a concern that this integration would move jobs out of the United States and into competitor economies south of the border, in particular Mexico. And it is true that, you know, many areas in America's industrial heartlands began to decline in and around this time. And a lot of people were very angry by this. And so there was a connection between economic decline and also a sense amongst some people that their country was changing demographically as well. So there was economic fears, there was cultural fears, there was demographic fears about changing racial and ethnic composition, which all sort of boiled up into an anger which Breitbart and Bannon were absolute masters of capturing.
Would you rather your child had feminism or cancer?
People in both parties were less comforted by the appointment of Steve Bannon as chief strategist. He calls himself the champion of the so-called alt-right. Others use terms like white nationalism or white supremacist.
Bill Kristol, Republican spoiler, renegade Jew.
The solution to online harassment is simple. Women should log off.
All hail King Barack Obama, Emperor of the United States of America.
What makes a successful propagandist is the ability to ram home a very simple message over and over again. It's also to have a message that actually taps in to someone's heart as well as their head. And it was Bill Clinton who famously said, you know, you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. A propagandist is actually not interested in the messy business of governing. A propagandist is simply there to get you into power and to keep your power.
Going back in time, there was a lot of buzz and interest on the right of politics around Breitbart and what Breitbart was trying to do, and it was trying to provide an alternative platform for conservatives who felt that the mainstream media, or fake news, was not doing its job and they wanted a different platform. So Breitbart sort of emerged to sort of fill that space.
It was the centre of Breitbart world and Bannon world. Bannon actually used to live there. He didn't have a home. He crashed in the company offices. There was always, you know, parties and influential people going in and out, and it was for a while the centre of conservative politics.
Individuals that were working with Steve Bannon and indeed Bannon himself clearly began to have quite a strong impact on the debate in America. And that, I suspect, is how Bannon ended up becoming quite close and connected to the Trump campaign.
Their meetings were infrequent and sporadic and quick.
What are the things that Trump and Bannon have in common? I think that's an interesting question. One is they're outsiders, right? In some respects, Trump is the ultimate insider, but he is ultimately an outsider. He's laughed at by the elite. He has a giant chip on his shoulder. He has never really felt that he belongs, and he's never really felt he's been given the respect and the, you know, and the deference that he thinks he deserves. And I think probably Bannon is is similar. So these two outsiders, renegades, sort of collided and came together and probably saw something in themselves in one another, and probably that helped to cement their relationship.
When Breitbart himself dies and Bannon effectively takes over, Breitbart changes its tone. It's less sort of interested in Hollywood and entertainment stuff. It's much more about politics, the culture, things that Bannon is frankly interested in.
Andrew Breitbart died in 2012, and Bannon took it down an alt-right path.
There are lots of different readers of Breitbart, but what they all are is united by this idea that the American state and the way Western states exist is no longer tolerable. They all think that there should be some form of revolution.
I am officially running for President of the United States, and we are going to make our country great again.
Breitbart's funded by a father and daughter couple called Robert Mercer and Rebecca Mercer. And Robert Mercer made billions. He's a true billionaire, not a fake billionaire like Trump. He made billions in finance, and he's used a proportion of this money to fund lots of sort of conservative groups and alt-right groups. And so he was basically bankrolling Breitbart, and Bannon, who'd always attached himself to rich men, was just sort of beholden in some senses to Robert Mercer and his daughter Rebecca Mercer for their funding.
I'm the messenger. I'm just really the messenger. Although I've been a very good messenger, let's face it, right?
Mid-2016, Trump's campaign is in trouble. It looks very much like Trump is going to lose. You know, he's 10, 12, 15 points down in lots of polls against Hillary Clinton. He sacks his campaign manager, Paul Manafort, but he doesn't have anyone to replace him. He approaches an old friend called Roger Ailes, who used to run Fox News, a well-known figure on the conservative right. Ailes turns Trump down, probably for very good reason, because he thinks Trump's going to lose and he sees no good in being attached to a losing campaign. But the Mercers make a move, and they persuade Trump to appoint Steve Bannon as his campaign manager in August 2016.
Republican Donald Trump is overhauling his campaign again.
Overnight, we learned Trump is bringing in Breitbart News' Stephen Bannon as a campaign CEO and promoting one of his pollsters to campaign manager. The move comes just 82 days before the election and represents Trump's second campaign shakeup in 2 months.
Trump thinks he's going to lose, thinks it doesn't really matter who comes on board. You know, he wasn't in it to win it, he was in it for the publicity. You know, this was about his brand, this was about Trump not really becoming president of the United States. So he agrees. And that's how Bannon comes on board to Trump's campaign in August 2016. It's that connection between the Mercers funding Breitbart and they're in with the Trump campaign.
The President of the United States is the head of state. So he has all the responsibility that entails. And in many ways, he is seen as the head of the free world. He is America's chief executive. And what's really important, he's also commander-in-chief of all the US armed forces, the mightiest armed forces on this planet. So, you know, he is essentially the most powerful man in the world. And if you've got the president's ear, that's going to make you one of the most powerful men in the world.
So he's the chief strategist. He's in charge of making the campaign function. But organisation is not really one of Bannon's strong points. But what he does do is deliver a message. You know, he can articulate a position in a way that Trump never could. He's very well read. He has a coherent political philosophy. and he feels very passionately about these issues, all things that Trump doesn't. So in that sense, they're a good match. Bannon has everything that Trump doesn't. And he pushes this message of economic decline, and he blames it on globalization, he blames it on America's changing demography, and particularly blames it on immigration. And it's a message which speaks to citizens who feel oppressed and depressed in these critical northern states, the Rust Belt states.
I want to make America great again. We are a nation that is seriously troubled. We're losing our jobs. People are pouring into our country. The other day, we were deporting 800 people, and perhaps they passed the wrong button, they pressed the wrong button, or perhaps, worse than that, it was corruption. But these people that we were going to deport for good reason ended up becoming citizens.
What Bannon sees in Trump is a like-minded figure, a disruptor, someone who doesn't want to obey the rules, someone who looks at the state as it is and thinks that it's broken and dirty and corrupt.
They need to get government out of the way.
We've talked about Palin. That didn't work. She didn't run. But Trump, in many ways, was an ideal candidate because he was a blank canvas. And Trump had he had a sense that, sort of unspoken really, but as a real estate developer in New York, he saw sort of Japanese money coming in and buying up buildings that he wanted, and a hostility developed towards this sort of this foreign money. So he was not on board with the Bannon project writ large, mainly because he probably was ignorant of the Bannon project writ large, but there was enough synergies there for this to work.
Trump really became a master of the big set pieces, the big rallies, the arenas, using charisma, using new media, alternative media, and being completely willing and enthusiastic to attack established media. In some respects, it was a fusion of the old and the new. And in 2016, for lots of reasons we now know, he did understand mass psychology, and he did outflank much of the elite.
This is a historic night. The American people have spoken, and the American people have elected their new champion.
And I remember telling lots of people that, no, of course Trump wouldn't win. Trump didn't think he would win. Bannon didn't think he would win. They were as shell-shocked as everybody else. He was thinking about this as it was a marketing opportunity. He had conversations with Roger Ailes about setting up a new right-wing network after the election. Ailes thought he could leverage Trump's popularity and brand name into a new network, because obviously he'd just been laid off by Fox. They were planning all sorts of things for the post-election period. None of them involved governing. None of them involved in being president. None of them involved the White House. It doesn't really matter in a sense, was it Bannon or not? What matters is that Bannon thought it was him, and that for a while at least Trump thought it was Bannon, and he was prepared on the back of that to give Bannon this great power in the White House. Bannon became a sort of Svengali figure. It's the perception that matters here as much as the reality. Key players perceived it to be the case that Bannon had won it.
When we think of people like Steve Bannon, it's just worthwhile first thinking about how we see populism in general. There's always been a debate within populism about what it is, and one of the arguments at least is that it's actually very different from historic fascism. It's often been seen to be more reactionary, whereas fascism was revolutionary. The fascists wanted to create a new man. They wanted to completely do away with democracy, completely do away with liberalism, completely do away with capitalism. It was a forward-looking, very revolutionary ideology. Populism, it's often argued, is not like that. Populism, it's argued, is reactionary. It looks back, it's nostalgic, it's not really interested in the future. It's more interested in returning to this idealized past before modernity, globalization, mass immigration undermined the nation state. Steve Bannon is interesting because he doesn't really fit into either of those models. He is, in my mind at least, both reactionary and revolutionary. You know, he wants to challenge the status quo and the consensus as it is now, but he also, I think, has a very specific view about where we're headed in the future and is interested in talking about the future. I think he's much more preoccupied with this idea that we are in a civilizational struggle, that we're in the midst of an existential crisis, that we've reached a historic turning point in the evolution of mankind, civilization, and that many of the things that we're witnessing in politics today, many of the revolts around Brexit, Trump, Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, in his mind, I would suspect, symbolize this turning point, symbolize the fact that we're entering into a new era in our political history. And certainly, you know, that is, in some senses, what is happening. I mean, if you look at democracy over the last 100 years, I think it's fair to say that in some respects we are entering into a new era in our political chapter. The old left and right debates of the 20th century are being replaced by these new and much more complex debates about identity and who we are.
Bannon is part of a group of people who very successfully have promoted the idea that actually it's the Democratic Party which is now the party of elites rather than ordinary working Americans. And the Republican Party is now the party of ordinary working Americans, in particular, in Bannon's view, the white working class. And this is a complete switch, because that was the Democratic constituency since Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal.
Do you feel something's changing?
Well, it's going to be like Brexit. It's the polls are going to show Hillary winning, and when we wake up on the 9th, Trump is going to be our president.
I think as far as Hillary's honesty and integrity, I think they're really looking more into that now.
Yeah, it's going to bury her. She's going to go to prison.
The white working class were the core part of the Democratic New Deal, or Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. But now politics has switched.
Bannon then joined him on his staff as an advisor, a very key advisor. And what Bannon's there to do is to say to Trump, this is the direction of travel. These are the type of policies that we should bring about. You know, you have this mandate to sort of create chaos, if you like, to sort of overturn the system, to look at everything afresh, not to obey the normal rules of politics and diplomacy.
Bannon hadn't worked in politics until a few months before. His first job in politics was as Trump's campaign manager. And a few months later, they're in the White House. So it was chaos because of a lack of experience, on the one hand. It was chaotic also because the key principles were at war with each other. We have Steve Bannon, we have Jared Kushner, who doesn't really have a formal role, but he's a member of the family, and he's absolutely a key player in all this. We have his daughter, Ivanka, and we also have at the beginning Reince Priebus, who's allegedly, formally, his chief of staff. And they just fight and fight and fight. There was no steerage from the president. The president must set the tone, the president must set the direction, and only then can people like the chief of staff manage the White House. But in Trump's White House, the chief of staff spent most of his time managing up, managing the president, when he should have been managing down. And then we've got bomb throwers like Bannon in there, making it all so much worse. Despite his claims, you know, to be a big businessman, a incredibly successful businessman, basically ran a family firm. So he lived above the office in Trump Tower. This organization ran around him. He didn't manage a big team of employees. He didn't manage a big bureaucracy. It was just he walked down to the office and they did whatever he felt on that day, and that's pretty much how he ran the White House. He wasn't interested in staffing it. He wasn't interested in creating a good management structure. And because he wasn't interested in creating a good management structure, jobs were just left unoccupied.
We were troubled when the president-elect announced that Steve Bannon would be a senior advisor in the White House. He, in his own words, has presided over making his former business, Breitbart, the platform for the alt-right. This loose-knit group of white supremacists, anti-Semites, and racists.
As far as Bannon's concerned, American society has faced 4 great crises. There's the Revolution, there's the Civil War, there's the Great Depression, and the 4th is happening in Bannon's eyes today, and that is mass immigration. He regards that as cataclysmic.
Certainly Bannon's pushing a sort of a Judeo-Christian view of the world, where America is a white country, it's a Christian country, to some extent isolated from the world, because as soon as you open yourself up to the world, whether it's through trade or whether it's through immigration, that goal of having sort of a homogenous population dies. So this sort of there's in a sense that America needs to withdraw inwards to protect these core values, which is white, it's Christian, and it's not brown and it's not Muslim. But I think that's more Bannon's thinking than it is Trump's. I think Trump had some sort of, core anti-foreign instincts driven by his own experience of trade, of being a property developer in New York City. But the philosophy here is very much Bannon's, and Bannon's feeding Trump these lines. He's trying to move him rightward, trying to use Trump as a vehicle for his own political philosophy, his own political agenda. It's very difficult to get things done via the congressional route. So presidents often instead use their executive power, the power to execute the law. So they can't do anything which is against the law. They can't go against laws that have been passed by Congress. They can't do anything that's unconstitutional. But within laws passed by Congress and within the confines of the Constitution, they can write executive orders. They can require things to be done.
Should I do it? Yeah!
Trump signs an enormous amount of executive orders. I think more rapidly than any other American president in history. Certainly when you see, Trump signing Executive Order 3,000,002, whatever it is, look at the photos of those orders being signed. Who's in the background but Steve Bannon?
Going back to 9/11, Islam becomes to be seen by some people on the right as a dangerous ideology, as a revolutionary ideology. Some go as far as, sort of thinking about this as a conflict between Christianity and Islam. It's a key aspect of sort of alt-right ideology. This idea that there's going to be a clash of civilizations, using Samuel Huntington's terminology here. But taking that idea further, and that there's going to be a battle between these two different worlds. So there are some very strong anti-Islam themes in alt-right and Bannonist thought.
The FBI now believes the massacre in San Bernardino was an act of foreign-inspired terrorism.
There was a terrorist incident in San Bernardino in California during the 2016 campaign, which triggered Trump to come out and say that he was going to stop all Muslims entering the United States until they could figure out what the hell was going on.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives
can figure out what the hell is going on.
That statement about banning all Muslims entering the United States is what forms the basis of the travel ban. Of course, the travel ban only applies to sort of 7 or so countries. It's much narrower, but it's still incendiary because it still appears it does, directly prevent the immigration of a certain class of peoples, Muslims.
Clearly, there is a limit to how many people any country can have coming in and at what rate people come in. Clearly, if 1 million people arrive in your country in 1 week, how are you going to school them, feed them, house them, clothe them? These are problems. But for a populist, in some ways, the more unchecked immigration there is, that fuels the flames. The bigger the problem, the more power and the more their rhetoric is going to be listened to.
Bannon thinks the establishment, the bureaucracy, is the enemy. And so he wants to swerve around these establishment elites who he thinks will undermine or attenuate his project of change. Bannon didn't want to take that route because he thought these were veto points. These would all try to block his proposed policy changes. So essentially, the Muslim travel ban was written at his direction by Stephen Miller at a time when the bureaucrats had all gone home and no one could stop it, and the effect was absolute chaos at the nation's airports. But Bannon indicated that was exactly what he wanted. He wanted it to cause chaos. This is going back to Bannon as a bomb thrower theme, which is very prevalent here. That was Bannon's way.
Well, isn't it better now than later?
Trump and Bannon will defend themselves to this day by saying, no, we're not banning Muslims, we're just banning people from these countries where a lot of bad people we think happen to be. And that's how they defend it. They knew it was going to be controversial, and they liked the fact it was controversial.
There was no way that the Muslim travel ban, as conceived in any of its 3 iterations, would have passed Congress. There's too many veto points in that institution for that to become law. So the executive order is the only way to do it. Now, executive orders, they have to be lawful. The Muslim travel ban was determined not to be lawful and was struck down by various courts. They rewrote it a second time, that was also struck down. And a third time, it was allowed to go into effect, but it was in a much attenuated form compared with that first incendiary executive order, which was issued a week into Trump's presidency.
No hate, no fear, Muslims are welcome here.
Steve Bannon is the White House chief strategist, but even that title may not do justice to his influence in the West Wing. He's driving decisions on every piece of President Trump's agenda, domestic and foreign, including the president's immigration order and travel ban that sparked a global backlash. But it's his elevation to a permanent spot on the National Security Council that is now outraging even many Republicans, who question why he has a seat alongside the Secretary of State and Defense Secretary in the inner sanctum of national security.
The National Security Council is where it's happening. And to have a political operative like Bannon on board is extraordinarily unusual. He originally was given a position on the National Security Council at the expense of Joint Chiefs of Staff and other, key military personnel. But this caused a huge kerfuffle, and eventually he relinquished that position. There's never been a political advisor on that board, and he eventually stepped down. He was withdrawn. Did you see the Time magazine cover called The Great Manipulator? And he certainly saw himself as a great manipulator, as a puppeteer almost.
No president wants to look as though his advisor is in charge of him or her. If Bannon's looking too big for his boots, that's only going to end up one way.
Trump had to be the main man. He was the strong man. He was the man who was directing the orchestra. He was not a player. But it certainly spoke to Bannon's view that he was somehow in charge, that he was manipulating things, that he was, the man behind the scenes. And Bannon loved that. Bannon loved the idea that he was really in charge. And he was certainly very influential. Don't get me wrong, he was very, very influential. But he wasn't in charge, and that was the slide, which ultimately resulted in his resignation a few months later.